talk and this Q&A that was very related to Next and essentially the topic of your talk. It was indeed very refreshing to see, let's say, what happens on the other side of the aisle, right? And how
Yeah,
there's some cross
totally.
correlation. You said something really interesting there about like learning from everybody, and I wanted to jump in real quick to ask you a couple of questions that are not necessarily entirely related to Next, but in general about
For
how
sure.
you see development and this concept that you just mentioned about developer experience being very important for you. So the world is very different now, from all the way down to you writing your dev thoughts blog back in your Moodless
Yeah.
time.
Wow,
That's a
that
big
is
cut,
I used
right?
a bunch of memes in my talk. That's a word I haven't heard in a long time.
Dev thoughts.
That's a name I haven't heard in a long time.
So, well,
But yeah, that was my blog, Dev Thought.
that's how it all started, right? And since
Yes.
then, well, there has been a Cambric explosion of developer tooling. We live in a very privileged world, in a sense, because we have a lot of developer tools
Absolutely.
are at our disposal. However, there's sometimes a big difficulty for internal teams to make the case for developing internal tools. So, what are some tips that you maybe could share with some of these passionate developers that want to do more for their teams? And sometimes it's difficult for them to make the case with senior management, like, oh, we want to build this little tool and it's now focusing on
Yeah.
things. So, yeah, what's on your mind there?
That's a lot of great context and a great question. So thank you. So a lot has changed about the world insofar the Cambric explosion has been in the open source
Yeah,
ecosystem, right? So I was talking the other day on an open source panel, and one of the people that even experienced open source way before me, when I was like 5 years old, was sharing this insight that managers used to reject the premise of open source.
true. Yeah.
Like that was like, oh, is that a toy? Is that do you want
All
to
mine
ruin
is
our
money.
business? Are you a hobbyist? Yeah, exactly. All this like negative sentiment about open source. And that was coming from the management layer.
Yeah,
That was coming from the suits, and the pinstripes. And the world has literally flipped upside down.
true.
Nowadays, imagine arguing to a manager, and again, like I don't want to misrepresent the entire world, and I'm sure that even today exists. Like people are skeptical of open source, but
Hmm.
when you're thinking about like modern development, a lot of managers will say, "Well, let's go with the open source tool. I don't want lock-in. I want to be able to read the code. I want to be able to audit it for security reasons. If our company gets acquired, you know, we know that we can take Next.js and deploy it in
Oh,
the
true.
acquirer's infrastructure if
Mhm.
needed. Like there's all this uh, amazing advantages on a business level for open source.
Mhm.
Recruiting, another one. So there's all these advantages. So one thing I mentioned in my talk is like sticking to your core beliefs and sticking to the axioms. And I think all the people that deep down thought this is the future of open source is the future. It has all these amazing benefits, and they were able to overcome the skepticism, right?
Yeah.
Those are the people that then ended up winning a lot for their careers, for their tech choices, for better sleepful nights, not debugging proprietary software and things like that. So you can make the same case today that if a team wants to contribute to open source, if a team wants to extend open source projects with custom tooling, maybe they'll face some skepticism, but then over the long haul, we all know the benefits, right? We all know what developer experience will do for products, for the bottom line of a business in terms of adding new features, making things faster.
Yeah.
So my advice would be always sticking to those important axioms that if you're going to develop tooling, you know that there is an amazing business outcome on the other side of the equation. And then even if you're met with a skepticism, you stick to that principle.
One of the things that I know that you stick to is this idea that hyperlinks in general, like web development, are
Absolutely.
the technology of liberation, right? Like theology of
Absolutely.
liberation. So this is actually very related to open source, as you point. And open source is used by many developers also as an entry point into like the bigger tech scene. What are some tips that you could give to like these very common role of a mid-year senior kind of engineer that wants to do more, but it's approaching this plateau of I'm comfortable what I do with what I do, and I know that I can still do it for a long time, but I know there's something more out there. So how could you like approach telling them, well, actually take the jump and contribute, because this is now the other side of the equation, right?
Yeah, I think you answered it already better than I possibly could, because you mentioned the power of the hyperlink, and you mentioned which is amazing, by the way. So thank you. You mentioned I had a blog called Dev Thought way back in the day, and to me, putting stuff on there and having that hyperlink that I could share with the world was was allowing me to make this like almost like quantum
Yeah.
leaps in my career, right? Because I remember there were two articles on DevThought that made it to the front page of dig.com,
Wow.
which was all the rage before Reddit sort of came along. And it exposed me to this massive world of basically everybody. Everybody was on there. Like everyone in Silicon Valley. I wasn't in Silicon Valley yet, but everyone was like on the front page of
Yeah.
Dig all the time. And it was all because I created some content, put in a hyperlink, submitted it to that particular website at the time. And now there's better websites and better media and better ways of channeling that. But the idea is the exact same. You know, put content out there, put opinions out there. Open source is about strong opinions in a lot of cases, I shared in my talk. So having that sort of connection between you and the outside world, no matter where you are, that's, I think, how I would do it again and again and again. It could be that you create a great app, so you have a hyperlink on even, you don't even have to buy a domain. You can have a domain on like
Yeah,
.vercel.app,
exactly.
and you share that. Or you have a blog, you know, like I'm fond of even like forget about like what even framework you choose. Just
Mhm.
create index.html and start putting an ordered lists, and then a bunch of anchor tags,
Yeah.
and then another folder called posts, and then hello world.html, and maybe throw in some awesome default style sheet that makes everything beautiful with no effort,
Hey,
and then
I'm seeing a
push it.
presentation happening here, right? Like how
Yeah,
I
right.
created my
Okay,
static site.
I'll write that down, Israel, because you're absolutely goddamn right. That would be such an awesome presentation. I'm gonna call it your next static blog, and the next part is gonna be the pun, because we're not gonna do it on Next.js. We're just literally just gonna put a few HTML files out there, and like that's gonna be the most productive way. By the way, I recommend two blogs
Mhm.
on that note. One is Dan Luce. He used to be an engineer. I believe he was at Google, but he then became an early engineer in the Bing team. And he thoughtfully writes about all these awesome topics
Mhm.
in tech, like how has the latency of our keyboards degraded over time? Like literally the
Yeah.
latency of like keystroke press to kernel signal on Linux.
Wow.
And his blog is basically just I think he literally doesn't have any custom CSS. And to the dismay of myself, because like the text flows from
Yes.
side to side of the page. I know that a lot of
Your
developers these
ultra
days are
wide
buying the
screen.
super ultra wide. So I don't recommend that much. Like do throw in some like max width CSS property in there, but there's that one, and then I think I'm blanking on the name. There's one in the Java world. Um, I'll probably
Yeah.
include that as part of my presentation, by the way. But I love these blogs where like they're
They're what they are,
sticking to their
right?
content,
Content
and
is
they're
king.
it's just a static blog. Put it in a repo and import it to Vercel, and it's free to host. And yeah, like just do it. You know, put the content out there.
So you mentioned over there like productivity and how even like the keyboard is such an important thing in the way that we work, and this is just as long with other developer tools we have. What are some exciting things that you are looking for in the developer ergonomics kind of scene? Is there something that you are like, oh, I heard about this
Yeah.
thing,
Oh, there's so much.
GPT-3 maybe?
Where to start? Where to start? Okay, so let's use the Vercel motto of develop, preview, ship. So there's lots of 10x opportunities on each phase, on the develop, on the preview, and the ship. So maybe on the ship, by the way, like the Edge 10x is a little bit of is too ambitious. And again, we're dealing with the speed of light, so like I don't want to overpromise and underdeliver.
Defy the
But
laws
on
of
the
physics.
yeah, exactly, like wormholes. I was just watching Dark and like the
Yeah,
Einstein-Rosen bridge. Like, okay,
such an
I
awesome
don't want to rule
series.
out faster than light communication, but okay, let's talk about the next couple of years. So on the develop side, with Next.js 10 is already under a flag with Webpack incremental builds. What we're going to do is that your developer experience is going to do as little as possible, like Vite, where you're basically not even manipulating text that should not be manipulated. Like, why would you run a page that you're writing through Babel, Acorn, types, like all these things, if all you need, if the browser natively supports it? So that's a trend that we're going toward, is the development server doing as little as possible. I do see there that it's a potential 10x opportunity. Why? Because right now it might take, sometimes for heavier pages, 200 milliseconds. It could take 20. So 10x.
Yeah.
On the preview, and what do we call it, Vercel preview, is like you push and you want the URL back with your content as soon as possible. I don't want to give away too much, but we just had a talk with our team where some ideas were presented where like I see like another 10x, 20x opportunity there, where like you push and you get your link back, and like, and holy crap, how can it be that fast? On the ship side, you're right. So like there's amazing technology coming to the edge, like HTTP3, and we can even go further and say 5G, right? Like we can combine a lot of these things. I think that 10x there is possible in some cohorts, in some phases. Like for example, like you could argue that like zero RTT TLS, basically HTTP3 is making the handshake so fast that on certain networks, or like when you're switching from Wi-Fi to LTE and resuming a TCP session, TCP, like an HTTP3 session, I could see a 10x there. And all of this going to happen, you know, if you're using Vercel just completely invisibly. We recently made such an improvement where we made our network use Anycast for routing. So what that means basically is that we route you the most efficiently possible to the nearest edge. And this is invisible to most developers, but for certain people, it actually delivered a 2x, 3x, 4x improvement. Why? Because maybe you had a customer in Brazil that was getting misrouted to New York, where in reality there was a New York edge, and that was because the routing infrastructure was like not great. So I do think that on the edge side, there's just all these amazing things happening. I wouldn't even count so much on hardware seeing a 10x, right? Like it's well understood that like
there was this announcement yesterday about 5 nanometer consumer grade products from Apple, for example, right? Which is impressive. Like,
but I wouldn't count all my blessings there, because I do think that we can do so much to make. And going back to why does Dan Liu not add style sheets and JS and all that? Because like a lot of what he writes about is like computers are already incredibly fast. You know, like let's be more optimal with how we develop our software, right? Like that's exactly. So like there's so many 10x's, 20x's, 50x's that we can do, even without counting on, you know, manufacturing getting so good that we get those kind of processors. So, but if that happens, this is the beautiful thing of the world of technology. Is like everything is improving all the time on every layer.
That's absolutely true. And there's one last question probably, which has to do with this improving. Typically in our industry as well, well, the enterprise world is always a bit behind in some cases, right, more than others, because of the huge size of some of their applications or the concerns that they address. Now, Vercel is making its way also into the enterprise world more and more because of how flexible it is to use, and there's a lot of benefits that it brings, which also poses the question, I think, for your team to have to balance these two very different communities, right? The enterprise world that has a different set of requirements, and the open, independent, single developer kind of community. So
Totally.
what are some tips you could give to software as a service companies that are in that same kind of disjunctive?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. So people value different things, and by people I mean like organizations, entities, individuals value different parts of this equation, right? So, for example, what we're finding with enterprises is that they value the workflow of constant improvement that we give them, of knowledge sharing that we give them, of all in one. Okay, so let's say I hire a new front-end developer. Here's your Vercel account. You're productive from day one. I didn't have to do anything. And, you know, that in some ways outweighs even the developer experience, because like whether you get 20 millisecond or 200 millisecond HMR times on localhost, that other thing is so valuable that you know, they'll still go with it. And like our DNA is more on the, you know, of course we're going to do that, of course we're going to provide that value, but we have that developer focused DNA, and that's where our value system is and where our aspirations are. So it's about balancing. It's about and being realistic with yourself, because let's say that you over optimize just one of these variables and completely overlook the other, then you're going to fail. You know, like you're not going to be as successful as you could be. So having that kind of like ability to like zoom out and be like, okay, so what things are valuable to each kind of person? As a great question that Maria had was like, you know, how can I apply this technology to accessibility? And you know, like you always have to like think about, you know, everyone has their
Different set
sort
of
of focus, right? And it's great to have companies that have all these experts in every field and give them power to execute on each thing. So for example, optimizing rendering a lot but sacrificing accessibility, again, not great. So the balancing act is like what makes this really
very
fun, I
tricky.
think.
Yeah, especially the business side as well. I can imagine that there are so many things riding at the same time in how the community
Regulation,
yes.
compliance,
Exactly.
security, role-based access, like, you know,
SSO for some,
documentation on other levels, right? Like we're known for having great
yes.
documentation on the Next.js side, but then like an enterprise comes in and is like, okay, show me your documentation for this other random thing that, you know, has nothing to do with the development lifecycle. That's why I like to think of it as like life cycles, right? Like there is different values and different priorities for each part of the life cycle.
That's absolutely true. Guillermo, I really want to thank you again for being part of Vue.js Global. It was great to have you here. I think that it was already due. We were really excited to see you back in February in Front-End Developer Lab, but well, now it's actually
Yeah,
a
I
possibility.
apologize to
Now it's
everyone
fantastic to
because
see you here, actually.
yeah, I
Well,
apologize because I never I always want to meet every event and every schedule, but
sometimes it
I took
happens.
I took the leap of faith of I think COVID will be worse than it seems, and it was very early, and I was like, you know, just gonna err on the safer
Visionary.
side.
Well,
Well,
speaking of
yeah,
how is your team dealing with this? Because you are already a primary remote company, but even
yeah,
being a primary remote company, there are many challenges to face, right, in this new normality. So how is
yeah,
your team
totally.
dealing with this?
Yeah, we're trying to be as open-minded as possible about
Yeah.
what everybody needs, and we're resetting our expectations, you know, like at the end of the day, like people have more important things to deal with right now. We have had a few scares. We had a coworker that was in
Oh,
Wuhan. We have
wow.
had a few scares with some coworkers, even as of recently with COVID.
Mhm.
So
It's
we know we
terrible.
basically tell them just don't work, do whatever you need to do, and like it's about being dynamic and adaptable and very empathetic to what's going on.
Maybe tune to an online conference like this one with sound effects, as you see here from my background at the moment. No, but
Thank you.
Guillermo, thank you very much once again for being part of this Vue.js Global event we are putting together for the community and for taking my questions. I'm really happy we had a chance to talk. And well, we will see you next time. And thank you all for being part of the QA.